Is your normal blood work missing a key sign of metabolic dysfunction? And could a hidden blood marker be silently driving weight gain and brain fog? Could your morning smoothie or healthy snack be quietly sabotaging your health? We unpack this with today's guest, Dr. David Perlmutter, world-renowned neurologist, director of neuroscience at Berberine Therapeutics, and his latest book, another New York Times bestseller, Drop Acid, focuses on the pivotal role of uric acid in metabolic disease. Today we'll cover why uric acid, a little-known metabolic signal, may be the missing link in your health journey, how uric acid drives fat storage, blood sugar issues, and even cognitive decline, and how to lower uric acid naturally, including how to do so via supporting your gut. Dr. David Perlmutter, welcome back to the show.
Well, I'm Michael. Great to see you. I'm delighted to be back.
It's been a while. You've been a busy bee, and uric acid is one of the things on your radar. So I'm excited to discuss more about this topic. And like I was saying a moment ago, pretty timely with my father recently having some gout, some high uric acid. So a lot of this, motivated to help inform his decisions with our conversation.
That's true. We tend to pigeonhole things that we learn in our medical training in terms of what they do in the body. Like we say testosterone is a male hormone and progesterone is, a female hormone that is progestational, and that's all we want to, we don't want to expand on things. And to think that uric acid, which we really identified through our training as being the mediator of gout or not gout, and that's the end of it. I've learned my lesson. Let's move on to the next topic. It oftentimes is a little bit challenging to us to recognize that these chemicals in our bodies do a multitude of different things, uric acid not being any different. And then, the idea that we have recognized for decades that uric acid seems to be related to metabolic issues, but now we are understanding that mechanistically it's actually causing some of these metabolic issues. And so therefore, with metabolic issues being so front and center these days in terms of our declining health, it's really very valuable to have yet another tool in the toolbox, being controlling our uric acid, being so central to helping us. It's not the whole story, but helping us maintain better metabolic health.
Yeah, very well said. And there's a quote from your book that I think could launch us into this discussion. As you state, uric acid sits at the heart of regulatory mechanisms involved in our most fundamental processes of metabolism. And it is these processes that, when they go awry, end up manifesting themselves as the most pervasive health issues of our time.
That's right. In fact, these chronic degenerative conditions that I am referring to in that statement are ranked by the World Health Organization as the #1 cause of death on our planet. Not some kind of pandemic, not a war, not anything you might assume, but it's the chronic, smoldering, inflammatory, metabolic conditions, the coronary artery disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, cancer, etc., that really are our undoing and are significantly related to lifestyle choice, which is a good thing because then it allows us to make better choices and then sort of offset these issues. And again, mechanistically, they're related to changes in our metabolism. We, are more familiar with the idea that our high blood sugars, for example, are a metabolic threat to our health. Sure. And insulin resistance, you've talked about it extensively, is a threat to our metabolic health and has long-term consequence. But uric acid, again, people have heard of this uric acid in the context of gout. Uric acid happens to be a molecule that is a very, very important signaling molecule that originally was a lifesaver for us. We developed higher levels of uric acid in the late summer and early fall to trigger our bodies to make fat so we could survive during times of caloric scarcity, i.e. the winter time. And those who would survive were those who had higher levels of uric acid as a survival mechanism that elevated because they ate more of the fruit that was ripening in the late summer and in the early fall. I mean, we see this in
Right.
primates. We see it in bears. When you see a bear getting ready to hibernate to make it through the
Mm.
winter, she or he is eating lots of berries, pounds and pounds of berries full of fructose. Fructose is metabolized in the body to uric acid, and uric acid is a signaling molecule telling the body basically winter is coming. Make fat, reduce your ability to burn fat, reduce your total energy expenditure, and ultimately allow you to survive. So more and more natural selection allowed those individuals with higher levels of uric acid to make it through the winter and therefore reproduce. Hence, we humans are pretty challenged with high levels of uric acid in comparison to other mammals.
Oh, and by the way, if this is helpful, please comment. I'm always curious to engage. Subscribe so you see future videos from us, and share with someone you think this might help. And there's a number of these parallels of the selection pressure that evolution leads to, let's say, as another example, a strong inflammatory response may have been helpful for our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Modern day, that may lead to a heightened risk of autoimmunity. So when the environment was different, that was an asset. As the environment changes, that's now a liability. And like you said before, there's lifestyle factors that we can essentially use to change the environment so as to put us more in alignment with our genes.
That's right. What you're describing has been called evolutionary environmental mismatch. That the genetics that we have currently, and therefore the physiology, how our body works that we all possess currently, doesn't really line up with the experiences we have, how we're confronted by our modern environments in terms of toxicity, the foods we're eating, the stress that we experience, the anxiety, the lack of sleep. All of these factors conspire to work against us because they don't match up with how our bodies are designed, or
Right.
have been shaped by our evolution.
I think people understand that too much fructose can be problematic. This really came into vogue with high fructose corn syrup. But how do you kind of delineate from fructose as in fruit as compared to high fructose corn syrup in processed foods? And how should people sort of separate these two that may be confusing on the surface to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about the dose. And go ahead and eat an apple. You're going to get 5 grams of fructose in an apple. Some grapes, whatever fruit you want to have. You don't want to overdo it, but you don't want to have apple juice. You don't want to have orange juice because you're then immediately delivering a huge amount of fructose to your body that, we can handle about 5 grams of fructose in the small intestine. When you get higher levels than that, then we begin to amplify uric acid production, and we're sending a powerful signal to our bodies, as I mentioned, to make fat, to ratchet down mitochondrial function, and ultimately, lead to metabolic dysfunction. So
Mm,
when you eat an apple, for example, and I think this is where you're going with that question, you're delivering that fructose along with other things like fiber to slow its absorption, vitamin C to increase fructose or uric acid secretion, rather, as opposed to a sudden bombardment of
right.
36 grams of sugar in a 12-ounce glass of orange juice or Coke or whatever it may be, or 16-ounce glass,
Sure.
that is just overwhelming. And that fructose level then goes dramatically up and is absorbed directly through the lining of the small intestine to then ultimately make its way to the liver, where uric acid then is manifests. So, in a way, the upside of that again for our ancestors was, oh wow, suddenly we've gotten fructose, which happens only at a certain time of the year when the fruit ripens, as a way of preparing for winter. Make more fat. But now we are stimulating that same survival pathway that was so wonderful for us 365 days a year, telling our bodies make fat, get ready for winter, raise the blood pressure, and this is our undoing. So what happens these days is we make all this extra body fat, and now we turn to drugs like GLP-1 agonist drugs to combat the fact that we are simply activating a survival mechanism. It's a
Right.
bit catawampus, if that's not a medical term, but seems to fit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's I guess a number of wampus things current day that we need to start talking about so that people can choose with more deliberateness what they put in their mouth. And
Yeah, and that was really the purpose of the book, Drop Acid. And I will admit that this book was constructed at a time prior to the advent, the taking over of the planet of the GLP-1 agonist drugs. And so it again really stands as a stark confrontation for, in my eyes, and hopefully in the reader's eyes, that this is a confrontation between, again, our evolution of our physiology and our current environment, which is so, you mentioned high fructose corn syrup, where 60 to 70% of all foods in the grocery store, packaged foods, have added sweetener because we love sweet. We love it. Sweet
yeah,
is a powerful signal to our brains to make us eat more so we will survive, and telling us that it is a safe food. By and large, in nature, foods that are sweet are safe to eat, not the ones that are threatening in their flavor. So
sure.
we're hacking into our brain's desire for sweet when we add sweetener to these various foods that shouldn't be sweetened, but nonetheless, as you mentioned, high fructose corn syrup is probably the cheapest form of sweetener available on the planet and is really sweet. Fructose is very, very sweet. So added to food, so we eat more of them. Good for the people who make these, frankenfoods, so we're going to eat a lot of their food and come back because we are designed to seek out sweet as a survival mechanism. Again, in the late summer, we wanted to eat the berries. We went to those berries and ate them, gobbled them up, because it allowed us to add fat and survive. So it's an interesting perspective, isn't it? That this is an ancient survival pathway uh, that
Yeah.
seemed to develop in our primate ancestor called proconsul about 8 million years ago, and
Hmm.
now persists in you and me today and every other human walking the planet.
And I think very perniciously leveraged, to your point in processed foods, something that's always struck me is that if you look at most, for example, beef jerkies, not in a food that we would associate with the second ingredient being added sugar. It's kind of mind blowing if you think that, to the untrained eye, not looking at the ingredient label, you would think beef jerky contains beef, maybe some salt, pepper, but not the second ingredient being sugar.
Yeah, and baby foods.
Yeah, it's
Think about
scary.
that.
Yeah,
Get them started. Cater to that
get them
in
young. Yeah.
desire for sweet early on in life, and you've got a customer. It reminds me of when the GIs came back from World War II. They were given free cigarettes. Get them started. Makes
Yeah.
sense to me.
Right. All right. Well, we've been developing this point of how the environment can be a big trigger. What other modern day commonplace practices, alcohol, perhaps sleep, what other things should people be aware of that can be spurring excessive uric acid?
Oh, everything you mentioned. Alcohol is actually metabolized in the very same way as is fructose, very same pathway. So, back in the day, we were always told what we should be doing for our patients who have high sugar, rather uric acid levels, and we were told, well, they should be avoiding high purine foods because purines are the breakdown products of DNA and RNA. So anything that has cells is going to, with DNA and or RNA, is going to break down to form purines. And we were told that we should be counseling our gout patients who have high uric acids to avoid the high purine foods, cut back on the amount of meat that you consume. And certainly the types of meat seem to matter. Organ meats are particularly high in purines, as are small fish like sardines and anchovies, my favorite, for other reasons. But and certainly alcohol. A gout was the king of diseases and the disease of kings, meaning that those who were very affluent back in the day and could eat, the mutton and the meat and drink the wine, which is metabolized to uric acid as well, ended up getting gout. You see the images of them with their sore toes, etc. But it's unfortunate that even to this day, when you go online to some of the major clinics and seek out nutritional information to help control your elevated uric acid, you'll see that messaging that I just relayed, and that is avoid foods that are high in purines. But that's not the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is fructose. Fructose is the big player as it relates to elevated uric acid in our modern society. And it's really the increased consumption of fructose via the development of the technology to create high fructose corn syrup from corn that began in the 1950s that really got us into this mess whereby our uric acid levels have been skyrocketing in comparison to the uric acid levels of people living, several decades before us. So those levels are climbing and they're in lockstep with our increased consumption of sugar, not our increased consumption of higher purine foods, the meats, the wines, the small fish, the
Hmm.
various types of cheeses, etc. So the big issue is not what we are led to believe when you go on the various named clinics sites to find out how I can lower my uric acid, what should I be doing from a dietary perspective. For whatever reason, they don't mention fructose. And I will
Yeah.
leave it to your viewers to try to noodle over why it is that these big organizations on their websites are not talking about fructose.
Yeah.
Maybe that'd be another discussion. But that said, it's fructose. And the first three things I think that need to be avoided are fructose, number one. Number two would be fructose. And number three, probably fructose. And then, down the line, we start to think about the various, high purine foods that need to be reduced, and even alcohol and certain types of alcohol, especially beer, is really a high instigator of production of uric acid. Why? Because beer is high in purines because of the yeast from which it is made. So they are actually in Japan now, because of this relationship to producing high uric acid, marketing purine-free beer. You still have the alcohol, you still have some sugar, but you don't have the purines anymore. So that's, again, why beer is such an issue as it relates to gout and as it relates to elevation of uric acid, well beyond gout, and why uric acid elevation is something we should be thinking about in patients with coronary artery disease, patients with dementia, patients with diabetes, patients with
Hmm.
hypertension. All of these can be related mechanistically to having a higher uric acid level. So it's something we really need to know. We're told that to reduce our risk of gout, by all means, keep your uric acid level below 7. And in fact, the lab won't even flag a uric acid level in a blood test unless it's above 7. Therefore, your doctor won't be clued in to reaching out to you and saying, hey, your uric acid level is elevated. It's over 7. Now we got to pay attention to it. Turns out that a uric acid level of 5.5 is really anything above that associated with cardiovascular risk, for example. So it's this thing about the lab values being in the normal level or normal range versus being in the ideal range. And, Dr. Ruscio, every one of your listeners, I think, wants to be in the ideal range, the optimal range for health, not just normal, because normal, by today's standards, meaning
Yeah.
average, really sucky, as it were, not so good.
Not a cohort you want to be in. I would
No.
agree. And a few really important threads, the gut yeast connection, I want to come back to in 1 second because I think that could be really interesting to our audience, knowing that at least presumed fungal overgrowth is something that a fair proportion of them are probably thinking about, maybe struggling with. But taking one step back, thinking about my father again, he got the advice to avoid things like organ meats. While
True.
simultaneously, I'm saying, Dad, gosh, the
Totally.
nutrient density in these, is really important for you to be getting in your diet. So he's confronted with this. Well, my conventional doctor is saying avoid those foods. My son, who I think knows what he's talking about, is saying eat some of those foods. It would seem to me that the solution would be kind of like you're alluding, reduce fruit consumption. You can have some, not too much. Certainly reduce high fructose corn syrup, alcohol, and that allows you to get the nutrient dense organ meats in. But what would you want to say to someone who might hear that and needs a little more of a push to have the confidence in following those recommendations?
Well, the easiest thing to do is to, when we're trying to uh, give people advice in terms of what they should be eating vis-a-vis their blood sugar. We pop a continuous glucose monitor on their arm, and then they know. They know right away what's elevating their blood sugar. You can do the same thing with uric acid. I mean, you can, here's my home uric acid measuring thing where you put a drop of blood on a piece of paper and you stick it in the machine. It tells you your uric acid level. My last one was what? I don't know if you can see that, 4.7. So that's what we want.
Oh,
So
fantastic. I didn't even realize there was a finger prick device for that. That's
UAssure,
fantastic.
UASURE. There's several actually that are out there, but
Okay.
then you get feedback, and I think that
Yeah.
your dad would realize it's not the meat he's eating, might be the alcohol, but drink a Mr. Pibb or a Dr. Pepper or something, Mountain Dew, and then
Right.
watch the uric acid level go up. It's astounding, and I think when people get that kind of feedback, then they know.
Yeah.
They know
That's
it's
great.
not the fact that they had a lamb chop last night, or that they had a glass of red wine, for that matter. And they'll see that the big player is, in fact, their fructose consumption. So, and it may well be fruit if you're eating fruit in excess, or you're eating fruit that is particularly high in fruit sugar. We call that fructose. That's where the word comes from. And these are the
Sure.
melons and watermelon that I had last night. And certain foods are higher, especially dried fruits seem to be instigators of raising uric acid. But by and large, I think an apple a day does keep the doctor at bay or at way, or however you want to say
Hmm.
it. And again, because it doesn't really challenge your body to raise its uric acid level significantly, it doesn't really do it at all. It's only 5 grams, as mentioned, of fructose. And having said that, actually, that's 5 grams of total sugar, and it's not all fructose, some is glucose. But also the delivery system. You don't drink, that sugar suddenly and bombard your body. You're eating an apple, and by its nature, it's going to take you some time to do so. And
Right.
then it's packaged with all that fiber to slow the absorption of the
Yeah.
fructose.
And polyphenols,
Go for it.
antioxidants. Yeah.
Yeah, you bet. All of those things. And that said, there are plenty of things in fruits and vegetables that help us rid our bodies of uric acid as well. Things like
Yeah.
quercetin and luteolin that are polyphenols that are found in various foods that we consume.
Sure.
And therefore, that's why vegetables are helpful for lowering uric acid, even though, for example, things like broccoli have a pretty high level of purines. It turns out that when you look at large data sets of people who've completed a food frequency questionnaire, in other words, what are you eating,
Hmm.
that people who eat a lot of broccoli have lower uric acids, even though it's a high purine food.
Yeah. This makes sense. Sure. Kind of like fish and mercury. And there's a lot of data showing that as long as you're not eating copious amounts of, let's say, tuna, swordfish, or whale meat, your cognitive outcomes are improved from consuming fatty fish, even though there might be a small amount of mercury contained therein.
Yeah, I've cut back lately on the whale meat, but
Right. Yeah.
but you're right.
The
Um,
delicacy you have to be choosy with. Sure.
yeah, but I think that there is still there's still some good knowledge in the notion of avoiding some of those fish that are long lived and do bioaccumulate over a period of time. So, that's the argument in favor of smaller fish. And I did just mention sardines and anchovies, for example, that they're high in purines. I still think you can get it. I mean, you don't eat a lot of anchovies on your Caesar salad. And, if you're going to
Sure.
have a sardine sandwich or whatever you're going to use sardines for, or in your salad, generally don't eat a lot. It's not like that's the main source of protein.
Right.
So, good
And same
sources.
thing with organ meats, right? It's not a huge portion of liver that people are typically
That's
having.
right, and so many other positive aspects to eating organ meats, like iron, like B12,
Yeah. Sure.
certainly worthwhile. The protein value, that's for sure. And again, the avoidance based upon your uric acid level because of purine content, I think was overstated for an awful
Mm.
long
Yep.
time. And I think now that the relationship to fructose consumption is so clear, and the trends in terms of sugar consumption over the past couple of decades correlating to elevation of uric acid is very obvious as well.
Okay, let's recap foods that raise uric acid and foods that lower uric acid. The offenders are, in part, high fructose foods. These will all raise uric acid. So, sweetened beverages, the most pernicious would be the high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverages, dried fruits, and other sweets and refined sugars. Alcohol is also one of the worst offenders. Beer, liquor, and wine. And if you're going to consume a wine, a dry farm wine will be the least offensive, but alcohol we should categorically be very careful with. And then you can consume and should consume due to the nutrient density, but just be careful not to overdo it. Excessive intake of high purine foods. Again, these are healthy and nutrient rich, but should be careful not to overconsume them. Organ meats, red meats, and small fish like sardines and anchovies. Now, conversely, there are a number of foods to focus on. Mainly, these are polyphenol rich fruits and vegetables, including but not limited to cherries, berries like blueberries and strawberries, citrus fruits like oranges and grapefruits, broccoli, leafy greens, spinach and kale as two examples, other fruits and vegetables, and also finally, olive oil.
Let me back up a little bit, Dr. Ruscio, for your viewers, and that is we're talking about something called uric acid that we've always looked at in the context of gout, now recognizing that elevated uric acid is a risk factor for diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and dementia. And the uric acid is being stimulated in your body when you consume higher levels of fructose in things like orange juice and sodas and processed foods that are sweetened. So that's the value of understanding your uric acid level and why I wrote that book.
And I love that feedback mechanism with a testing device, especially again for someone like my father who's more of an engineering mind. I think that biofeedback is going to
Totally.
be incredibly helpful. And I could also see, just speculating here, that because
I know
I'm
where this is
picturing
going.
when my father's had flares, it's usually on vacation, and we'll go out to dinner. He'll have a glass of wine or two or a beer, plus he'll splurge and have a steak. And I think he misassociates the red meat being the factor rather than the alcohol. And I don't want people to have to not consume any, be able to not consume any alcohol, but I would much rather them have the meat than the alcohol if we're in a kind of precarious metabolic position where they're still very
Totally. And,
sensitive.
I think as time moves forward, we're becoming, I think, less and less supportive of even the 1 to 2 glasses of wine a day. Alcohol is
Yeah.
a neurotoxin, no matter how you slice it. Is there an upside with the various polyphenols and other components? I suspect so. But man,
It's
I just
outstripped by everything
it's
else.
just risk benefit ratio.
Yeah.
But again, the type of alcohol I think is really very important. It's the alcohol itself that raises uric acid. So if the alcohol, much as we talked about the fructose being delivered in the apple, the alcohol is delivered in red wine along with things that are helpful, polyphenols that red wine contain, then the context again is really valuable, much as I talked about beer. Here's alcohol, but delivered in a very purine-rich environment that would have much more of an effect, a dramatic effect.
And this might be getting a little bit into the weeds, but these dry farm wines, the more traditional wines, they have a lower maturation period, therefore lower histamine. I'm not sure how that impacts the uric acid. I know they're typically lower in alcohol also. Do you have any information, any thoughts on sort of those more traditional dry farm wines maybe being better than a more conventional wine?
Well, I mean, I tend to gravitate towards those types of wines because of the sustainability by which they are produced, the fact that they are organic. The alcohol content in dry farm wines, I think, across the board is a little bit lower. So, those are really important boxes to check in my book, and that's why that's my recommendation. I do feel that red versus white, I drink both, but drink hardly any at this point, which I can really appreciate because since I've backed down over the past couple of years drinking alcohol, when I do, I feel it with the first sip. It's
Yeah.
crazy. My cytochrome P450 alcohol dehydrogenase enzymes are probably really, really very poorly active at this point because I'm not stimulating them anymore. But having said that, Yeah, I think that in all your choices of food and beverage, to go organic and to go sustainable and to look at regenerative agriculture, those are all very important things that are good for you and good for others and good for the planet.
Sure. When you had released your book a couple years back, it put more so on my radar uric acid. And as our audience knows, I'm a pretty fervent reader in PubMed. I get a number of alerts every time an abstract is published, including one of my main areas of interest is probiotics. And I said, what do you know? Probiotic clinical trial lowered uric acid. And then a few months later, there was another one, and culminating with a meta analysis in 2022 of probiotic interventions being able to lower uric acid, which hints at one of the components you mentioned earlier, which is the gut, at least yeast, right? I mean, dietary yeast, or I could also argue, I think, gastrointestinal yeast overgrowth could lead to high levels of uric acid. It's an inference, but knowing that probiotic supplementation can rectify fungal overgrowth, it would at least in part make sense that a fungal overgrowth in the gut could be contributing to a high uric acid burden. Okay, let's cover a probiotic protocol for lowering uric acid. Remember that mechanistically, probiotics will alleviate dysbiosis, inhibit xanthine oxidase, metabolize purines, and also reduce inflammation, all collectively, which lead to this uric acid lowering effect. The specific type of probiotic would be a blend, a multi species blend of different lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species. Remember, I mentioned a meta analysis across all these different clinical trials. The commonality was a blend predominated by lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species, targeting a minimum dose of 1 billion CFU per day. Higher is okay, but you want to hit that minimum threshold of 1 billion and for a duration of 2 months or longer.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about fungus in the gut, both dietary and I guess fungal overgrowth in the gut?
Yeah, let me step back just a moment because and just more globally talk about the relationship then between the microbiome and uric acid. And it's a
Please.
bidirectional relationship. We know that higher levels of uric acid actually change the microbiome, lead to
Mm,
dysbiosis, altering the diversity and the representation and even the metabolome, even the products that our gut bacteria and other organisms, there are, as you mentioned, fungi and even viruses in the gut, but that this is influenced by our uric acid level in a good way, oddly enough, that higher levels, for our ancestors anyhow, higher levels of uric acid changed or change our array of bacteria in the gut such that it helps push us towards metabolic dysfunction because that was for survival a good thing. Let me
right.
just unpack that a little bit more. Another mechanism whereby elevation of uric acid in our ancestors preparing for winter, another pathway by which this elevation of uric acid could be helpful was by changing our gut bacteria such that it would pave the way for elevation of blood sugar to power the brain to help us find food, help us make and store fat, and downgrade our utilization of energy and therefore be able
Mm,
to preserve energy, i.e., calories in the form of fat and less so
right.
glycogen. So that was a survival mechanism that's not serving us well today because now we know that those exact changes in the microbiome are the gut changes, the dysbiosis that are associated with metabolic issues like type 2 diabetes. How profound is that? It's so profound that one Scandinavian researcher has recently, and I know I'm digressing, but what the hey, recently published a paper in which he treated type 2 diabetics with a fecal microbial transplant. In other words,
Mm,
replaced their gut fecal organisms with those of a healthy person, and their type 2 diabetes improved or even went away. But having said that, then the relationship between alterations in the gut microbiome and elevation of uric acid, which has been demonstrated in rodents as well, when these changes in the gut microbiome have been induced by transplanting to these rodents
Mm,
human fecal material with metabolic diseases, will
right.
raise uric acid. So it's what we call a feed-forward cycle that was a good mechanism that whereby elevation of uric acid changes microbiome, biological changes in the gut, enhanced the increase in uric acid, keeping it getting higher and higher, survival mechanism. So it goes both ways. Now, let me get back to your interesting thesis referencing yeast. So anything that's going to raise yeast in the body and importantly in the gut will ultimately downstream uric acid. Why? Because these yeast organisms, when they are lysed or broken open, will release their genetic information that elevates purines, and that can raise uric acid. So it is one other explanation as to why there are higher levels of markers of inflammation that we see in patients who have dysbiosis with yeast overgrowth. And frankly, we do see elevation of these inflammatory markers as well, even without yeast overgrowth, when there are alterations of the gut bacteria, which then leads us to appreciating the fundamental role of our food choices as it relates to the health of the microbiome.
Mm. Very well said. And it gets me thinking about how, with people who have fungal overgrowth in the gut, brain fog and sort of this central fatigue seems to be much more present than in IBS, IBD, SIBO. So, for our audience, perhaps a component of what's going on there, one of a few components, could be high candida. When the immune system is attacking those and lysing them, as you say, you have release of purines and the sort of neurotoxic impact that the uric acid seems to impart. It's very
That's right.
interesting.
And, ultimately anything that increases the production of these inflammatory chemicals, we call them cytokines, uh, when these cytokines make their way, and they do, through the blood-brain barrier, ultimately do impart in the brain issues that lead to brain fog and cognitive decline, and ultimately, truly in the long run, pave the way for neurodegenerative conditions like actual Alzheimer's itself and even Parkinson's, and increase the likelihood of stroke by changing the way the brain's immune system is able to function. I mean, when we're talking about this brain's immune system, the innate immune system in the brain, we're focusing on a unique population of cells called the microglia. And these cells make up about 10% of all the cells in the brain. And they exist in a multitude of forms of what we call phenotypes. But to simplify it, let's just say two forms, helpful and harmful. Helpful being M2 and harmful being M1. And we want our brain's microglial cells to be there to clean up debris, to reduce inflammation, to shore up the blood-brain barrier, to nurture the formation of new brain cells and synapses, and that's what they do. But when they are challenged by the presence of these inflammatory chemicals, inflammatory cytokines, that could have come from the gut and oftentimes do come from the gut when the gut is leaky, brought on by overgrowth of yeast or dysbiosis. These inflammatory chemicals make their way to the brain and shift the brain's immune cells away from being friend to being foe, becoming the evil twin, whereby now these cells are digesting away our synapses, are threatening the integrity of the blood-brain barrier, are leading to a reduction in the ability the brain has to gobble up misfolded proteins like beta amyloid, and even a reduction in the growth of new brain cells. That's an important polarization shift in our brain's immune cells. The good news is that we now recognize that there are things that we can be doing to shift them back to being helpful, away from being the evil twin. And in many ways, that starts at the gut.
Hmm. And this reoccurring theme of runaway inflammation, right? Inflammation is our friend to some extent up to a point, but once we hit this tipping point, then inflammation becomes chronic and all these negative things happen: mitochondrial function, microcirculation, microglial activation, astrocyte activation. It's just a sort of a feed forward mechanism, like you also said before. And the good news for someone who might be struggling with brain fog, fatigue, let's say insomnia, also something that we didn't talk about, but I'm assuming there's some research tying high uric acid to sleep problems, given that so much of sleep is centrally mediated. There is a path out of this, which is, multifold, but certainly getting uric acid in check and your gut health as part of that process can really move the needle, as I know you see all the time with readers of the book and people that you've worked with.
Yeah, we actually published a paper in February of 2021, along with Dr. Rick Johnson, Robert Lustig, myself, and others, really unpacking the relationship of fructose to ultimately Alzheimer's disease through the mechanism that you just described. And I think that, you know, it you alluded to the relationship then of everything converging on the mitochondria. And
Mm,
we're really, approaching something now in our conversation today, that it is the mitochondria, the energy producers, the metabolic furnace of the cell that is regulating this activity, specifically in those brain immune cells, those microglia. That what shifts them from being friend to being foe is a change in their metabolism. They actually shift away, a little in the weeds here, but I'll walk through it, from mitochondria using what's called oxidative phosphorylation, using oxygen to burn sugar to make ATP energy molecules. They shift away from that to something called glycolysis.
mm,
And this is a metabolic shift in the brain's immune cells that characterizes their change from being anti-inflammatory to being pro-inflammatory. And you mentioned this quite appropriately, that shift then is a feed-forward cycle. The more these brain cells are stimulated by the inflammation, for example, coming from the gut, the more they shift into being pro-inflammatory, then producing more of those chemicals in the brain. We call that neuroinflammation. That does what? Continues to stimulate them to do even more bad things. And this is this cascade, downhill cascade, that is front and center the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And while this is happening, then these cells can no longer gobble up the beta amyloid that people talk about in Alzheimer's
yeah.
disease. So the amyloid is sort of a marker that this process is happening, but it's not the central cause. We've been sort of led to believe that, well, we see a lot of amyloid sometimes in the brain of the Alzheimer's patient, and if we can develop drugs to get rid of the amyloid, problem solved. And in fact, those drugs have been developed, and further, those drugs have been FDA approved, but they hardly at all affect the progressive downhill course
Yeah.
of cognitive function in the Alzheimer's patient. It's not the amyloid, it's what's upstream. It's the microglial cell activation to become pro-inflammatory that's really at the heart. How can I say that? Well, I can say it because now we are seeing research that targets this microglial cell and turns back on mitochondrial function. And the
Mm,
drugs that are able to do that are called GLP-1 agonist drugs. They
mm.
actually stimulate the microglial cells to regain good metabolism and are showing huge promise in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. I'm not advocating that listeners of yours today who might have a parent with Alzheimer's immediately go and put them on semaglutide or Ozempic or something like that. But you're going to see incredible research over the next year or two that validates that as an option. I mean, we've already seen it in Parkinson's, published in the New England
Very
Journal
interesting.
in May of 2024, a 3-year study demonstrating that in comparison to placebo, patients who declined 3 points on a Parkinson's disability scale, that those on a GLP-1 type drug, a Ozempic-like drug, actually slightly improved in terms of their disability. I've never, ever seen that. Well, I've seen it once in our glutathione study from 25 years ago. But that's treating the fire, not just the smoke. In other words, it's treating the underlying disease process, not
Right.
just the tremor and the rigidity, the physical manifestations.
Well, if we're going a little bit into the weeds, because this is really exciting to me, being a research nerd, and also I think our audience is always looking for what's the new cutting edge therapeutic, hyperbaric oxygen as one target for improving mitochondrial function in the brain, but also systemically. And then transcranial red light. We did a recent review on some of the research here, not just regular red light, because the red light panels, as great as they don't typically pulse at a rate of either 10 or 40 hertz that's needed for that either 870 or 1070 nanometer red light to be able to permeate the cranium. But with a specific red light helmet, there's some very interesting, I believe it was an Alzheimer's study that showed increased brain profusion with red light. And then there's a whole bunch of studies with hyperbaric, usually in post-traumatic brain injury models. Just curious what your thoughts are on these two
Yeah,
therapies.
and I think, to be fair, most of the red light research with transcranial has been done in Parkinson's, at least clinically. But let's take a step back. I don't think it's so 100% necessary that we penetrate the skull. I think that there is benefit to what might be happening in the skin, knowing full well that by reducing and increasing various chemicals in the skin and systemically in the body, that we're going to
Fair
affect
enough.
what goes on in the brain. So,
And that's
the
just
notion
really
that
quick,
we've
Dave.
got
That's
to
been bore
penetrate.
out by some studies showing reduced depression with just red light applied to the body. So that kind of reinforces your posit.
That's right, and we've seen reduced depression people who go outside, for crying out
Yeah,
loud,
fair
getting
enough.
it,
Yeah,
full spectrum light. Is it because, oh, they're making more vitamin D? What else is going on?
sure.
I think there are a lot of things that are happening very superficially, i.e., in the skin, that do ultimately affect what goes on in the brain. But with respect to the hyperbaric oxygen therapy, people have heard about going into an oxygen enriched environment under pressure. We began treating patients 25 years ago using hyperbarics, and have been watching the evolution of the research. A lot of the research that I used to rely upon was done by an Israeli doctor, Dr. Shai Afrati, who was able to demonstrate early on that CT findings, even in post-stroke patients, showed significant differences in those getting hyperbarics versus those who did not. And I think in trauma, we're seeing some pretty remarkable effects now. And
Mm,
so I've actually, as of a year ago, joined Dr. Afrati and Dr. Amir Haddani, both of whom, well, Dr. Haddani being Harvard trained, they're both Israeli clinicians, researchers. They have one of the world's largest hyperbaric centers in a place called the Villages in Central Florida.
mm.
4 chambers that treat 14 people at a time. And they've,
Wow.
they've learned some interesting things. I mean, cognitive improvement, that's for sure. Post-stroke improvement, well documented. Dr. Haddani did an acute study in individuals after 30 days who weren't recovering from COVID, demonstrating those receiving hyperbarics versus sham treatment. In other words, they went in the chamber, they didn't know they weren't getting
Yeah.
oxygen, and the differences were quite remarkable. And more recently, published a study looking at these individuals a year out and their improvements as it respect to activities of daily living, fatigue, pain that would interfere in their lives, brain fog, cognitive performance, more appropriate term, was kept. They kept this improvement. It was seen to
Wow.
really undergo no change, even though they had no further treatment. So, in other words, the
Yeah.
intervention put them back on their feet, quite literally and figuratively
Mhm.
as well. And interestingly, you mentioned that targets mitochondrial function. It does. The mitochondria require oxygen, so we're really kind of ramping up oxidative phosphorylation. But let me just recognize that the other aspects of mitochondrial or that play into mitochondrial function that seem to be induced in the presence of this therapy include both mitophagy, the getting rid of defective mitochondria, as well as mitochondrial biogenesis, the growth of new, better functioning mitochondria.
Yeah.
But I think most of the literature now is really centered on the fact that you mentioned perfusion, i.e., blood supply. That's the big player, because that can be measured, and indeed these researchers measure it, demonstrating better metabolism in the brain as a consequence of better blood flow to the brain. And the mechanism's relatively new in terms of being understood. And it's because of the ability of this therapy to induce something called hypoxia inducible factor 1 alpha. Well, that sounds complicated, but when the amount of oxygen in the blood changes, it induces this factor, and this factor it causes the increased production of something called vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF. Two things, actually, VEGF and nitric oxide that do two things. The VEGF improves the vascularity of the brain, and nitric oxide, as you know, increases the diameter of the blood vessels. So two things targeting improved blood supply to the brain and the rest of the body as well. But for our purposes, the brain is our discussion. Having said that, what they've more recently discovered is the name hypoxia inducible factor indicates that it's the hypoxia or lowered oxygen that tends to do it. And what Dr. Hadani and Dr. Afradi have made very clear is that it's not the hypoxia, the lower oxygen, or the elevation
Yeah.
of oxygen induced by hyperbaric oxygen. It's the delta.
Yeah.
It's the change. So it's the change that seems to induce the production of this thing that increases the nitric oxide, that increases VEGF, blood vessel growth, et cetera. You know, we've seen that, for example, we used to call it heat shock protein. People would go into a sauna, they increase their heat shock protein that did things to the folding of proteins that was healthful. And then we began to see, well, heat shock protein is induced with cold exposure too. You know, again, we label these things, and
Yeah.
we talked about this at the beginning of
Right.
our time together today. We label these things like uric acid being only associated with gout. Well, you know, we've got to be a little bit plastic in our utilization of these terms and nomenclature, and now we're seeing it's not heat shock or cold shock
Sure.
protein, it's thermal shock protein. Can go either way, a better term.
And to your point
So
about
yeah,
the delta in O2 levels, this is why many of the contemporary protocols are recommending a 5 minute taking the mask off break every
air
20
break.
minutes or so. So you get that hyperoxygen, hypoxia, hypoxia. So if you're in the chamber for an hour and a half, you get more of those deltas that's going to spur the VEGF and lead to
Totally. And so
angiogenesis and more blood vessel formation.
you're hacking into a mechanism in your body that should you be hypoxic, i.e., you move to, you know, Mile High City, or you move
Colorado.
to
Yeah.
Aspen,
Right.
and you know your body isn't going to adapt immediately. So this is a way to grow more blood vessels and expand your blood supply, such that you can then adapt to this environment. So you're really taking advantage of this stress to your
Yep.
body. And you know, we've known for a long time that athletes who exercise in hypoxic and low oxygen environments, it turns out to be a you know, positive attribute. It's a stress, hormetic stress.
Yep. Yep. David, I know in your book you have many interventions for people to lower uric acid, and I would highly recommend the book as a resource. Are there a few that you'd want to just, and obviously we hit a number of those in the discussion today, but a few that you'd want to either reiterate, excuse me, or mention for people?
The first would be to consciously reduce your fructose consumption. And the second would be probably the same thing, and the third, the same thing. But, you know, it turns out that anything that is, as you talked about earlier, threatening the microbiome will have an effect on uric acid. Other dietary issues will have an effect as well. But eating more colorful fruits and vegetables is a positive thing, helping us lower uric acid. Getting a good night's sleep, strangely, helps us with uric acid. Anything that lowers inflammation in the body helps to intercept and really reduce those feedback circuits whereby uric acid will be elevated. So, you know, again, I think there's probably a less of a call for us these days to indicate that alcohol consumption is a good thing. Turns out that coffee consumption is associated with a slightly lower uric acid level. Yippee. And then some nutritional supplements like vitamin C, quercetin, and luteolin, as well as tart cherry extract,
Mm,
one of the, kind of one of the traditional treatments for gout, tart cherry consumption.
right.
Well, it turns out that the extract of tart cherries, which you can buy in the health food store, along with quercetin, luteolin, vitamin C, tend to reduce uric acid formation and lead to higher levels of uric acid secretion.
So tart cherry is probably better than cranberry juice, given that the cranberry juice is probably going to have way too much fructose.
Cranberry juice, by and large, is really very sweetened, and you can buy unsweetened cranberry juice, and I think it's a great choice.
Okay,
Um, yeah, so, cranberry juice has some other health benefits, but I'd
sure.
say that if you're going to be, there's a brand that's in my mind right now. By and large, cranberry juice is very sweetened because cranberries are very tart as well. I mean, if you ever tried to eat a cranberry when people are, making the cranberries for Thanksgiving, grab one and chew it. It's tart, which is a good thing.
I still remember my uncle's, cranberry dish he would make at Thanksgiving. It was non-sweetened, and that would knock your socks off. It was
Well,
so
we
tart.
have great cranberry sauce at Thanksgiving, and we sweeten it with allulose.
Mm,
So
there you go.
allulose helps the body produce GLP-1 and helps actually blunt elevation of blood sugar after a meal, and even that
Interesting.
associated with exercise.
And with the coffee, I'm assuming, given that the studies have shown that whether it's caffeinated or decaf, probably due to the polyphenols, people have better outcomes across multiple endpoints measured. So I'm assuming it doesn't matter if it's caffeinated or decaf.
That's right. I mean, there are some upsides to caffeine, but not for everyone. And I would agree that, people say, well, should I drink coffee or not? Well, here's what caffeine does. Immediately you talk about coffee and the conversation goes to caffeine. There are 90 bioactive components of a cup of coffee. And perhaps one of the most powerful is something called chlorogenic acid that has really powerful health benefits in terms of inflammation and in terms of even its effect on organisms in the gut. So there's a lot more to coffee than caffeine, and your point is well taken as it relates to a consumption of decaf coffee, even as it relates to dementia risk. We see pretty similar results in people who are consumers of decaf coffee as well.
Yep, yep. So one indulgence, maybe that should be reframed as not necessarily an indulgence, as a health practice within reason. It does seem that there's probably an upper limit. I believe it's around 400 milligrams is where 400 milligrams in terms of total dose. And then obviously the timing, if it's too late in the day and it interferes with your sleep, then it can have a deleterious effect. But as long as you're underneath what I believe is a ceiling of 400 milligrams and you're not having it too late in the day, then coffee plus or minus the caffeine seems to be positive for your health.
Yeah, and I think your comments about, I mean, the half-life, if you're consuming caffeinated coffee, the half-life of caffeine in humans is 6 hours. That means if you have a double espresso at 6 p.m., at 12 p.m., you still have a single espresso on board. Good luck trying to go to
Yeah.
sleep. Well,
Yeah.
I think
Well
you
said.
know plenty of people, as do I, that will go to sleep with a shot of espresso at dinner and have no
Yeah.
problem. That's not me. So I have a caffeine curfew of about 2 p.m.
Here's a recap of the key takeaways from this conversation with Dr. David Perlmutter on how to lower your uric acid. Remember that managing uric acid can prevent metabolic and cognitive health issues. The ideal range of uric acid is less than 5.5, and you can track levels with a uric acid meter. And these are available online on Amazon, for example. They're very easy to access. Reduce fructose intake, especially from processed foods and sugary drinks. Focus on whole fruits and vegetables to manage uric acid. And coffee is also, yay, helpful at lowering uric acid. Integrate vitamin C, quercetin, and tart cherry to help reduce uric acid. Quality sleep is also very beneficial. Gut health plays a critical role in regulating uric acid, and probiotics are a powerful tool for lowering uric acid and also reaping both the metabolic and the cognitive benefits associated with healthy levels of uric acid. David, the book is Drop Acid. Anywhere else you'd want to point people, and any closing thoughts you want to leave people
Yes,
with?
people can go to drperlmutter.com, my website, drperlmutter.com, David Perlmutter on Instagram. My new book is called Brain Wars, and it's about these immune cells that I'm talking about, and how to win that war, Brain Wars. I will get a website up pretty soon, a landing page, and take it from there.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to maybe have you back on and
Oh,
delve
I'm
more into brain
right.
health.
That'll be spring of 26. So count me in. I'd love to.
Perfect. All right. Well, David, thank you again. Appreciate
Michael,
it.
great to see you, brother.